So, good evening everybody. I'm Axel Karrenberg from Germany, from the beautiful city of Cologne, famous for its cathedral. Let me zero in by asking who is working in Parkinson's disease. Okay, one, two, okay. So if I say something wrong, you will step up and then go in. Now I try to find a good introduction to combine Parkinson's disease with Russia and with Germany, and I think I found a quite interesting solution. Who of you knows the mystery of the bridges of Kaliningrad? Oh, okay. Can you explain it?
It's let's try in English.
You can do it in Russian, but I cannot control it.
Пройти по всем мостам Калининграда, причем пройдя по каждому из них один раз. Невозможно.
It's a kind of mathematical.
Yes. But what's the task?
Just cross every bridge
Once.
only once, and
Yes.
all bridges,
And
once every bridge.
once, and you have to come back
Yes.
at the beginning.
Yes.
Okay. Now, if we would have 2 hours, I would leave you alone, and you can start to do it, and there you got a problem, then you try this one, and then this is the dead end. It is a mathematical problem of the late 18th century, and it was solved by a mathematician named Euler, and it is not possible. So don't try at home. It is impossible for mathematical, topological reasons, and therefore I thought it's quite a good symbol for the history of Parkinson's disease and maybe for medical history in itself. We will see a couple of dead ends, but we will have a couple of boulevards. Okay, let me start with the credo of an eminent French medical historian who stated, the true protagonists on the stage of medical history are the diseases. Not the doctors, not the patients, but the diseases. That's quite provocative. Okay, but you will see why. Okay, we start here at bridge number 1 with our first issue, and this is naming Parkinson's disease. Why should this be a problem? According to a well-known narrative, well-known story, the English physician James Parkinson was the first to observe 6 individuals with a shaking palsy and to describe some of their symptoms. In this famous publication, I think many of you know. However, this pamphlet of Parkinson fell soon into oblivion. It was totally forgotten. In the 1860s, Jean-Martin Charcot, the first professor of neurology, appeared on the scene, saved Parkinson's description, and brought it into prominence. Charcot took advantage of a huge pool of patients at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris at that time, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 female patients. He took advantage of the then 1870s new neurological exam and the modern idea of specific neurological entities, diseases. It was not known before 1860. Taking into account all these factors, Charcot was able to separate Parkinson's disease from, let's say, multiple sclerosis and various other conditions. And Charcot showed backbone, introducing the label La maladie de Parkinson, Parkinson's disease. You see it here. This is one of the prescriptions of Charcot from his own hand. This narrative is correct, yet it represents only a small part of the historical truth. The shaking palsy was present in older individuals from time immemorial. Medical texts from various cultures, China, India, Greco-Roman civilization, and so on. Various texts mention tremor, thank you, palsy, and stiffness, and I'm sure there will also be an old Russian text before 1850 who mentions this symptom. Therefore, Parkinson did not describe a biologically new disease, nor was his outline clinically complete. But another physician presented a clear-cut sketch of this condition more than 100 years prior to Parkinson. In 1690, the Hungarian doctor Ferenc Papai-Paris published a multi-volume work titled Pax Corporis in Hungarian. It was never translated in any other language, and in the chapter on diseases of the head, Papai mentions a progressive disease originating in the brain. It was characterized by tremulousness, rigidity, hyperkinesia without sensory loss, and postural instability. Is someone here who can read Hungarian? That's a difficult language, so you can control me, but I checked with Hungarians, it is correct. Okay. So, if all this, the translation is correct, an important question arises. We are in the issue of naming. Shouldn't we from now on use the term Papai's disease and omit Parkinson's disease? Or at least Papai Parkinson's disease, PPD? Retrospective priority, however, is not a guarantee for renaming, most likely because the scientific community itself is reluctant to accept another eponym. It's sad, but it's like this. Thus, we have crossed the first bridge, but we have come to a dead end. For one of the most frequent neurological diseases, we use the name of a physician who wasn't the first to describe this condition and failed to do it in a clinically satisfying manner. Our second issue, the definition of Parkinson's disease, we are crossing bridge number 2 now, is an even more delicate one. Medical students and doctors learn during their professional training definitions of diseases, of course. They regard their state of knowledge as a kind of Archimedean point and use this intellectual platform for diagnosis and treatment on a daily basis. Now, the historical dimension comes into play. Medical knowledge, above all medical knowledge in the 20th century, had been anything but static. Around 1900, a purely clinical definition of the condition prevailed, of Parkinson's disease, drawn upon Parkinson's description and complemented by Charcot and many other clarifications. As early as 1913, so about 100 years ago, the renowned German neurologist Hermann Oppenheim confessed the essential nature of the disease, PD, is entirely unknown to us. 1913. Around that time, attention therefore shifted to anatomical research. These studies published by Bloch and Marinesco, by Brissot, by Levy or Louis, by Tretyakov, Vogt and Hassler, these studies and others launched the quest for the seat of the disease. By the way, we have the poster on Tretyakov this morning. Is the lady here? No. Oh, okay, so this is kind of the context of her poster from this morning. Levi, or Louis, who came out with the first description of the intracytoplasmatic bodies that were named after him, commented on this change as follows, I quote, "The clinical picture of paralysis agitans is a question of localization in particular regions of the central nervous system. Ironically, the leading role of morbid anatomy placed Parkinson's disease in danger of extinction as a distinct disorder. Parkinsonism, as a term, was now increasingly used to denote not a specific disease, but a syndrome related to site-specific lesions. The outbreak of encephalitis lethargica following the influenza epidemic during World War I, after World War I, fostered etiological considerations, and thus, from the early 1920s, well until the 60s, three main categories of Parkinsonism were distinguished: idiopathic, post-encephalitic, and arteriosclerotic. Sometimes a post-traumatic or a toxic origin was added, like for boxers, fighters, or with heavy metals like mangan and others. Okay, so far about the definition. We will pick this up later on. Let's now turn to the patients and their contributions to the history of PD. This is very often forgotten, that patients contribute to the history of medicine. Unfortunately, we know of no famous patient before 1800, mainly because many individuals conceived their ailment as variation of a normal aging process. The first authentic historical patient with Parkinson's disease adopted exactly this attitude. I'm talking about Wilhelm von Humboldt, very popular in Germany. He was a philologist. He was a founder of the University of Berlin, pioneer of linguistics, and so-called father of the German high school, German gymnasium. This is all the from him. He considered himself to be a shy and introverted man with a tendency to excessive controlling. Thus, he presented a pre-morbid personality, once regarded to be typical of patients with PD. On the other hand, historians can feel blessed that Humboldt had this disposition for self-observation and for writing hundreds of letters year by year. Now, at age 62, he noticed increasing abnormalities in his handwriting, and in his own words he said that in the inequality and lack of firmness of my handwriting is not due to the eyes, but just to the hand. And he went on, it must be really odd to my readers to see how every line starts with best intentions in large letters, here or here, only to end with ill success in barely legible small letters. So on the left-hand side, I just pointed to it, you can see an example of typical micrography with large letters at the beginning of the line and shrinking towards the end. On the right-hand side, there is an example of Humboldt's counter-strategy. He provided himself with ruled paper, and and took great pains to write large letters in order to remain legible for his correspondence. Following micrography, akinesia set in, age 63 or so, as well as the typical resting tremor, the often dominant symptom noted already by Parkinson in his essay. Experts of Humboldt's correspondence maintain that he depicted the symptoms much better than Parkinson at about the same time, and it was for Humboldt to present the first description of the so-called cogwheel phenomenon. You know that, cogwheel phenomenon? Okay, Humboldt spoke of, I quote, vibrations of the nerves which appear minor from the outside and distort the continuity of movements. Last doubts about Humboldt's diagnosis will be eliminated by this little statue exhibiting typical postural abnormalities. Okay, so far the patients. We continue our tour in the 20th century with a particularly intriguing period, that of early neurosurgical therapy based on neurophysiological findings. Neurosurgical interventions in PD began very crudely, very early, around 1900, and expanded into a more modern approach during the 1930s through the 1960s. One of the reasons for this development was that doctors began to think in neural circuits rather than in single anatomical sites. And this can be seen, or it's a good example. This is a textbook from a German medical student around 1940 with nice annotations. You see here thalamus, globus pallidus, locus coeruleus, which is now nucleus hypothalamicus, putamen, nucleus caudatum, substantia nigra, etc. The key targets for surgeons remained, of course, the same. The substantia nigra, the globus pallidus, the caudate nucleus up here, and putamen. Beginning in 1939, quite early still, the American surgeon Russell Mayers examined the effects of lesions in the caudate nucleus. He demonstrated that Parkinsonian tremor and rigidity could be improved surgically without impairing consciousness or producing weakness or spasticity. But the mortality rate of the interventions was so high that even the surgeon, Myers himself, recommended against such surgery. Soon thereafter, Irving Cooper, by accident, cut the anterior choroidal artery during surgery of a Parkinsonian patient and was forced to litigate it to prevent a hematoma. So this was a not very well done operation, and you may call it a side effect today. The unexpected and remarkable relief of tremor and rigidity led to more widespread use of the procedure, though mortality was still approximately 10%, or in some groups even higher. Furthermore, electrical coagulation procedures, this is Myers and Cooper, now we come to this series here, were performed by early stereotactic procedures by Vienna refugee Ernest Spiegel and Henry T. Weisses at Temple University in Philadelphia, and other surgeons, among them the founders of European stereotactic brain surgery. They focused more directly on the ventrolateral nucleus of the thalamus, and by the early 60s, most surgeons were lesioning only the thalamus or the subthalamus. From a contemporary point of view, all these reports here were hampered by two problems. First, the lack of involvement by medical neurologists with resultant concerns of incomplete reporting by the surgeons. Surgeons have a tendency for that in the past. And second, the lack of long-term follow-up and potential minimalization of morbidity. By the mid-60s, however, early surgical attempts were suddenly eclipsed and largely abandoned by the advent of a new pharmacological treatment. It is at this point, now we are coming to bridge number 5, that the so-called L-DOPA story begins. Before I get to the main events and protagonists of this story, I have to refer to two preceding developments. Pharmacological interferences in Parkinson-related conditions go far back in history, as go the descriptions, with two plants playing a key role. First to mention is Mucuna pruriens, in English cowwitch or powitch plant, I don't know the Russian name of course, which is in usage for thousands of years in traditional Indian medicine. Its less important European equivalent was Vicia faba, the horse bee. Both plants contain considerable quantities of L-DOPA. In 19th century Europe, however, treatment relied mainly on solanaceous alkaloids, above all atropine and hyoscyamine, duvoisine and scopolamine. Charcot's favorite remedy was, for instance, hyoscyamine. These agents are centrally active anticholinergic drugs that later would be understood to affect the cholinergic, dopaminergic balance in the striatum and thereby improve Parkinsonism. These empirically found drugs constituted until the middle of the 20th century the pharmacological standard therapy, and in the context of this relative, let's call it stagnation, stop, the impact of levodopa was magnified. The second relevant advancement, this is now maybe more interesting for those of you with basic research, the second advancement was the rise of neurochemistry as an independent science. It was in the 1950s when two seminal discoveries occurred and paved the way for rational therapeutics. One was the localization of dopamine within the mammalian brain. The other was the development of the reserpine model, later to be used as the first model of Parkinsonism that was reversed by levodopa treatment. In concert, these discoveries rapidly advanced hypotheses on the role of dopamine loss in the pathogenesis of Parkinson's disease itself. In 1959, Bertler, Rosengren, and Carlson and others concluded that, I quote, dopamine is concerned with the function of the striatum and thus with the control of movement. In the following year, the Viennese researchers, Herbert Ehringer and Ole Hornikiewicz, turned to the human brain for the first time. After examining a series of control specimens, they discovered the striatal dopamine depletion in brains from patients with idiopathic or post-encephalitic Parkinson. Knowing that levodopa was the natural precursor to dopamine, Hornikiewicz was now prepared to suggest human trials in PD patients. His colleague from Vienna, Walter Birkmeyer, received Hornikiewicz's supply of laboratory levodopa and injected it intravenously for the first time to Parkinsonian patients in 1961. The description of what both researchers called the L-DOPA effect is worth quoting a little bit longer because it still vividly conveys the dramatic improvement involved. Here is the key quote. You can read this by yourself. You can drink. It is almost a classical style gradation, so also almost literature. And for a broader public, this effect was dramatically staged 30 years later in the movie Awakenings. And as many of you know, the film is based on a book by Oliver Sacks, which is quite different from the film. And Oliver Sacks himself introduced the drug in a New York hospital. By the way, 2 or 3 years ago, it turned out that Bergmeyer was an ardent and really nasty Nazi in the 1930s, high-ranking Nazi officer, and like many of the German and Austrian researchers, there was almost no problem after the war. He got his habilitation when he became professor and could do all this research. Okay, in the years following these pioneering efforts, open-label levodopa trials with oral preparations confirmed both short and long-term benefits, and double-blind placebo-controlled trials followed. These reports launched levodopa's establishment as the premier agent to treat PD symptoms and signs. Although new formulations and peripherally acting dopa decarboxylase inhibitors added new dimensions to the treatment, none of these events rival the first discoveries. The distance now from more than 55 years to these events in the 1960s allows an even more detailed historical evaluation. The introduction of L-DOPA treatment in Parkinsonism represented the provisional climax in the evolution of neurochemistry. It was at this stage that clinic, neurochemistry, and neuroanatomy converged. Moreover, the successful treatment of Parkinsonian patients by Bergmeyer and colleagues confirmed and underscored the validity and utility of the neurochemical approach for the investigation and therapy of neurological disorders on a large scale. The more modern discoveries of enzyme inhibitors and dopamine agonists played a certain role. You can read this by yourself. Interesting is that amantadine was also discovered by chance in a New York condominium geriatric institution, and so on. But all these drugs have opened new horizons for future and further pharmacological developments. Now to bridge an issue number 6, modern surgery. In parallel with the development of new drugs, a renaissance of surgical methods took place. This trend was partly due to the growing recognition of the limitation of medical treatments. We all know patients that cannot go along very good for a longer time with the drugs. And it was partly due to the novel neuroimaging technology visualizing brain structures in vivo. Especially the MRI helped to target more precisely brain structures eligible for interventions with a result of a higher success rate and fewer risks for patients. It is, however, noteworthy that for 3 decades now, neurosurgeons have targeted different brain structures than their predecessors in the 50s and 60s. Since the late 1980s, the important role of the subthalamic nucleus in PD has been identified, allowing targeted therapies that modulate subthalamic nucleus activity to be effectively used for the management of Parkinson's patients. Initial beneficial results in animal models were subsequently confirmed in humans with PD. And most well-known outgrowth of this effect is that in 1987, Alain Louis Benabit and Pierre Pollack and other colleagues from the University of Grenoble in France pioneered the use of the non-destructive and reversible high-frequency stimulation of deep brain nuclei with implanted electrodes. Okay, the very last part of my contribution, which I will finish, is devoted to neurogenetics. But I will keep it short. Is somebody here who is in neurogenetics? Okay, I keep it short. I admit this is a field in which the historian, even if he is a neurologist, feels most puzzled to reconstruct a logic order of the events, last but not least because the enormous number of publications. Even a neurohistorian reaches the limits of his understanding, and thus I will touch only briefly on this subject by focusing on a few milestones. However, it is interesting to note for a historian that through much of the 20th century, Parkinson's disease was suspected to be a non-genetic disorder, in part because extended pedigrees of familial Parkinson, PD, were not available, and in part because exogenous factors, for example, neuroleptic medications and later the superheroin MPTP, were identified that produced forms of Parkinsonism similar to that of PD, and in part on the basis of twin studies that were interpreted as excluding a significant genetic etiology for Parkinson's disease. That all was pre-1990, pre-1980. Now, by 1990, a re-evaluation, including a meta-analysis of twin studies, suggested that genetic factors could be important to the pathogenesis of at least some forms of PD. Golby and co-workers reported an autosomal dominant form of PD in 2 large kindreds originating in the village of Contursi in the Salerno province of Italy. The disease in this kindred was characterized by often early onset and rapid progression, a low frequency of tremor, responsiveness to L-DOPA, and pathological findings typical of PD with Lewy bodies. In 1996, Polymeropoulos and co-authors at the NIH established a linkage of PD in the Contursi kindred to a specific chromosome area, an area to which the alpha-synuclein had been mapped. Shortly thereafter, the same author showed that the disease in this family and several Greek kindreds resulted from a mutation in the alpha-synuclein gene PARK1, right here. Following the recognition that familial Parkinson's disease could result from mutations in the alpha-synuclein gene, synuclein was rapidly shown to be the major fibrillar component of Lewy bodies and Lewy neurites in both sporadic PD and dementia with Lewy bodies. Subsequent studies have shown that mutated alpha-synuclein does not fold properly, resists proteasome degradation, and tends to form insoluble aggregates. Although mutations in the alpha-synuclein gene are rare and represent less than 1% of the worldwide burden of PD, these developments triggered intense interest and rapid progress in understanding the pathogenesis of PD. In 1998, only 1 year after the discovery of the alpha-synuclein mutation, Japanese researchers, I think I have to go back, here. Japanese researchers reported mutations in a separate gene named PARK2, whose protein was designated Parkin. PARK2 was found in Japanese families with early onset Parkinsonism, segregating as an autosomal recessive trait. Other previously reported families with juvenile onset Parkinsonism were also then reported to have mutations in the PARK2 gene. In 1998 then, research on this subject took a decisive turn when Kitada and colleagues suggested that Parkin may interfere with ubiquitin-mediated protein degradation and cause death of nigral neurons. In the following years, a variety of studies focused on the ubiquitin system and its enzymes, but I will stop here and leave the rest of this story open or to more knowledged people. Yet one thing is for sure, there is considerable evidence that neurogenetics is these days in the same historical situation as neurochemistry was 60 years ago. The crucial question is, will this be a success story similar to that of neurochemistry, culminating in the introduction of L-DOPA in the treatment of PD patients? Can the L-DOPA, in other words, be repeated on a genetic level? We shall see. Now, how can we wrap all this up? First, 30 seconds of theory-laden consideration, theory of medicine. The form of clinical nosology with which physicians and scientists deal every day is always a product of interaction between a biological process on the part of the patients, this is the patient's side, and a descriptive idiom on the side of the doctors, this is the right side of the diagram. Pathological biosignals find sooner or later their semantic equivalence. It is exactly this interrelation that has been subjected to constant change for the last 150 years, and this change will be continuing in the future. My very last slide visualizes the historical development in a nutshell. From today's point of view, a first and second period were characterized by descriptions of only clinical or morphological findings. A third period permitted an understanding of cerebral mechanisms. In a fourth segment, starting in the 1950s, successful efforts were made to apply this theoretical knowledge to therapeutical purposes, the classical bench-to-bedside approach. Finally, in a last period, in which we are now most likely, in this last year I started prophylactic interventions as a key objective of research. From description to intervention, this would be the shortest summary of the long history of Parkinson's disease. You have seen we have crossed the 7 bridges of Kaliningrad. We did not solve the problem, neither on a scientific, nor on a clinical, nor on a historical level, but I hope it was an interesting story. Thank you very much.